Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Smith with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I am the competition organizer for the Geothermal Collegiate Competition, which is funded by the Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies Office. The Geothermal Collegiate Competition engages student teams to develop and analyze forward-thinking concepts for direct energy systems using geothermal resources for a community or campus. We're very excited to have transitioned into a full academic competition year this year, so student teams will have more time to fully explore their proposed ideas and so that we can provide more webinars and resources for teams throughout the process. Thank you to our partner, Nation of Makers, for co-hosting this Wednesday webinar series. Today we'll be talking about geothermal energy and all of the exciting ways to utilize this technology. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the competition's HeroX page for future reference. If you do not want your image captured in this recording, please ensure that your camera is turned off. We will be holding a moderated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. However, we encourage you to post your questions in the chat throughout. And I do believe that our speaker will be encouraging participation during the workshop today. So make sure you're paying attention and you can answer his questions. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from. And I'm really pleased today to introduce our speaker, Mr. Gene Sumick. Gene is a registered professional geologist in both California and Texas with more than 45 years of professional experience in geothermal exploration and development throughout North, Central, and South America, the Caribbean, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. So basically everywhere that there's geothermal. His background includes extensive work in geology, geochemistry, geophysics, and geothermics. He has been the principal investigator for DOE-funded research and technology development programs in wellbore geophysics and enhanced geothermal systems. He worked for Unocal Geothermal for 17 years and was an exploration and development manager for Ormat Technologies until becoming the CEO and a principal at EGS Consulting Incorporated, where he's been responsible for geothermal resource evaluations worldwide. Gene served on the governing board of the Geothermal Resources Council and the Geysers Geothermal Association, and is an active member of the International Geothermal Association, American Geophysical Union, and the Geological Society of America. He received the Joseph Adlin Award from the GRC in 2015 for his lifetime contributions to geothermal exploration and development. And Gene is actually joining us today from Reykjavik, where he has been attending the World Geothermal Congress. So Gene, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I will give it over to you so that you can give us this great presentation.
Thanks very much. Hello from several time zones away. As Katie mentioned, I would prefer to keep things interactive, if at all possible. There are some rhetorical and not so rhetorical questions that I'd like to ask in the process of this presentation. So I would appreciate responses, or at least some sort of background to let me know what's going on. So I was asked to talk about sort of demystifying geothermal energy. So one of the first things is in exploring for geothermal energy, what exactly are we looking for? Well, and my slideshow is not working. Don't know why. Geothermal exploration is actually the search for heat. Everything else is just the effect of heat. So all the things that go along with it, things like hydrothermal alteration, changes in physical characteristics to the rocks that form a geothermal reservoir, those are all directly related to heat. And that would seem like it's a relatively straightforward process because the Earth is an active planet. So the amount of thermal energy in the upper 10 kilometers of the crust is really amazing. And what we can access is basically that 10 kilometers part, because we don't really even approach anything like the core of the Earth. But so think of it if you look at a globe in a library or sitting on your desk or something like that, the actual thickness of the crust that we deal with is about the thickness of the layer of paint on that globe. But it's a very important part of what we can do, because accessing that gives us access to a tremendous resource. And the thing about heat in the Earth is it's not evenly distributed. A lot of times we have to concentrate geothermal exploration in places where we're either consuming lithosphere or we're thinning the crust, where the levels of heat are very shallow in that upper 10 kilometers, and we can access it more readily. So in this particular illustration, particularly for the United States, someplace like offshore Oregon, you're looking at the Cascade Mountains for a lot of magmatic input. And that's one key thing about accessing that heat. Or say, for instance, in the Basin Range in Nevada, the level of the mantle is very much shallower in that particular area. And so the heat is more accessible. But as we get away from those areas, we wind up seeing the temperatures being much, much deeper. It's not that they go away, it's just that they don't increase as rapidly as elsewhere. And that's illustrated here too. So the green area that you wind up seeing east of the Rocky Mountains, that's, let's see if my laser pointer, can you see the pointer? East of the Rocky Mountains, we're looking at this sort of trend of the increase in heat. And the illustration of the contrast of distribution, if you take a look here at the Sierra Nevada in California, and you take a very short jaunt to someplace like Reno right here, the difference between those two heat flow regimes is decidedly different. And further out in the very thin crust out here in the Basin Range, in the Battle Mountain area, we're looking at very rapid increase in temperature with depth, to the point that we can get to past 250 degrees C at about 3 or 4 kilometers. So that's a very important part of exploration for geothermal resources. Variable performance of the PowerPoint here. Okay, for some reason my PowerPoint is frozen. So those tectonically active areas have been extremely important in where most of geothermal exploration has occurred. And it's all of those tectonically active areas on the globe. Specifically, you may be familiar with this area in the Pacific. It's commonly referred to in the non-technical press as the Ring of Fire, but also East African Rift and all of this convergent zone through here in Europe. And I apologize. I'm not sure why my slides aren't advancing. So what do we need for a geothermal system? Well, basically, we need a heat source, preferably a young heat source. So what do we mean by young? Well, I'm a geologist, and to me, 5 million years is relatively recently. But preferably, given that we need a very active heat source, we're looking at something that's probably less than 1 million years old if we're looking at higher grade or higher heat content geothermal resources. And we also need fluid, that would be water. And we also need the Holy Grail, permeability, because we need to be able to circulate the water through fractured rocks in order to be able to mine the heat from the heat source. And because of that, geothermal systems are commonly graded on the basis of their heat content. So in this particular instance, we're looking at the distribution of high temperature resources clear out to 350 degrees Celsius and depths of in the range of about 4 kilometers. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to focus on what are commonly referred to as high enthalpy or high heat content, or often referred to as electric grade resources, the resources that you can actually produce to generate electricity. So we're looking at a couple of different technologies, but they're all in the very high temperature range of maybe 150 C to about 300 degrees C. And for most of this discussion, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to dismiss things like direct use, which I know is part of the focus of this program. And we're not going to necessarily dismiss things that have future promise. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for the moment, let's talk about just conventional geothermal development. So in this particular case, those resources we're talking about are here, sort of in the middle. We're looking at the ability to be able to either flash a small percentage off of steam off of hot water, or use a secondary working fluid. And the other things like direct use applications are here for relatively lower temperatures and not necessarily electric grade resources. And you're also looking at the potential of very much higher temperature resources as you go very much deeper. So we can, in a very limited number of settings, specifically like the geysers in Northern California, we can take dry steam that exists in the geothermal reservoir and send it directly through a turbine and generate electricity. But in a more general sense, for most resources, those dry steam resources, steam-dominated resources, are very, very limited in the world. And usually what we wind up doing is we bring a small amount of water or flow to the surface, flash off a small amount of steam, and then use that steam to generate electricity. And those two content resources, somewhere in the range of 150 to maybe 200 degrees C, we're looking at potentially bringing fluid to the surface, exchanging heat with a secondary working fluid, and using that secondary working fluid to generate electricity. And that's expanded considerably in the Basin Range, where the majority of the resources are kind of like moderate heat content and not necessarily really, really high heat content above 200 degrees C. So this is a diagram everybody loves to hate, but it gives you an idea of the time and the money that it takes to actually explore and discover a geothermal resource. So the things we've got here are the basic timeline. We're looking at a 5-year span of time between just doing reconnaissance work, defining the prospect, actually discovering something, confirming it, and then developing it, doing all these things down here that this talk doesn't necessarily deal with, but definitely comes after you've discovered the resource. And then in terms of the money, sorry about that. Let me see if I can go back. In terms of the money, we're looking at a few $1,000s for basic geology work, and yet it's very core to exploration. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and eventually, of course, millions of dollars once we wind up getting into doing the actual work of drilling and producing a geothermal resource. So volcanoes are a very direct indication of heat. And volcanoes aren't necessarily always erupting. They're not always necessarily erupting in your face, but they continue to produce a lot of material that gives you, in evaluating the geology, a lot of background as to the nature of the heat source, exactly the structures that control it, and exactly where the potential heat sources are for a geothermal system. So I don't know how many people listening were alive at the time of the Mount St. Helens eruption. I don't know. Is there a way to see? I don't see on my screen any potential responses. But Mount St. Helens in 1980 was a very impressive volcanic event, the first active volcanic event in the United States after the early 1900s in Mount Lassen. And it certainly had a devastating effect on the Pacific Northwest. But Mount St. Helens, down here, on this sort of volcanic explosivity index, think of this as a Richter scale of volcanic eruptions. The USGS has come up with this to sort of compare different volcanic eruptions. So here's Mount St. Helens, and something like Long Valley Caldera in Eastern California is a very much larger volcanic system. So the caldera is actually this sort of semicircular feature on this satellite image. So Mount St. Helens put out about a cubic kilometer worth of new material, of new ash. And some places like Long Valley erupted more than 600 cubic kilometers of ash that blanketed the topography 760,000 years ago. And that's definitely a huge, huge indication of the heat source. So generations of suffering petrologists have established that an eruption like that, the actual volume of the eruption, really only constitutes about 10% of the actual magma that's there in the crust. So you can think about it, 6,000 cubic kilometers of molten rock in the crust. That makes a very viable geothermal heat source. And there actually is a geothermal development right here in Long Valley Caldera. So hot springs are another indication of heat. They're very important because they can tell us all kinds of things about exactly what's happening within the resource. And that's why we spend so much time and so much effort in trying to collect samples to give us an idea of where the water has come from, what the potential reservoir temperatures might be, and even such things as problems that might exist if we develop a resource. So to illustrate that sort of dependence on heat, here's a comparison of the chloride content of different water types. So this is seawater, and seawater is very much more chloride rich than almost all of these geothermal waters. Here, geyser in Iceland, it's not a typo, it's their word, and that's how it's spelled. From New Zealand, and also places in the Basin Range in the United States, Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone, Steamboat Springs in Nevada. You can see the contrast. But if we pay attention to other things, like let's say silica, notice the difference. Seawater here is very, very low in silica, but all the geothermal waters are very high in silica. So the question is, why? And the answer is heat, because the content of silica in water is directly related to the temperature of the water. So all geothermal fluids tend to be very much higher in silica, and you can calculate what, excuse me, what potential reservoir temperatures might be from exactly that sort of chemistry. And that's the basis of all geochemistry, all the things like gases, dissolved solids, trace elements, isotopic exchange, all those things are dependent on heat. Geophysics is a very important part of exploration because it gives us at least a first pass at being able to think in 3 dimensions, to define something that we can't necessarily just examine at the surface. One of the methods is, one of the preferred methods is magnetotellurics. High school physics, the Earth is a magnet and it's spinning in a streaming electrical current, the solar wind. And that streaming electrical current generates earth currents known as telluric currents. And so you can measure those telluric currents. It's a relatively non-invasive method of being able to figure out resistivity, because one of the things about those heat processes and circulating fluids is that they're altering the rocks. They're creating clay. And the clay with a little bit of water is very much lower in resistivity than all of the other rocks around it. So to illustrate, this is different levels of interpretation for MT, successive detail from the bottom to the top, 1D to 3D. And one of the important things to pay attention to are the temperature contours on this particular slide. So geothermal systems, a lot like ore forming systems, have a caprock to them, usually very rich in clay. And that's what separates the geothermal system from the incursion of cold water that would quench the geothermal system. And you can take different cross-sectional slices at different elevations and see the sort of evolution of into the geothermal reservoir if you can do a sufficient amount of detail with a sufficient amount of MT information. It's a very important tool for figuring out, again, the third dimension and potentially what a geothermal reservoir might look like and where you might target parts of the geothermal reservoir in order to be able to produce it. The one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't define temperature. And in order to do that, we have to drill. There's no other way to actually measure the temperature in the earth except to drill. And that's where we start winding up spending a good deal of money in the range of several tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it's not a cheap process at all. And we measure the conductive heat flow in the earth. And you do this experiment every single time you cook something on the stove. Conduction is movement of heat in the solid state, as opposed to convection here in the interior of this pot that I've illustrated. So a geothermal system would be the convection part. And what we're measuring heat in is the surrounding rocks that are affected by that convective process. We're heating the pot at very high temperatures. If we're using natural gas, it would be like 2000 degrees. But convection is such an efficient process that it moves the heat very, very effectively and prevents the pot from being melted. And it's very effective, and a very effective way of moving heat in the crust. Every geothermal anomaly is a very significant heat flow anomaly in the crust because of that very efficient method of moving heat, convection. So to that, in every geothermal system, we're looking at different grades of increase in heat. So if you remember back to that United States map, all of those colored lines are actually now quantified by the sort of number of degrees C per kilometer that heat flow increases as we go deeper into the earth. And we have a sort of a speed limit. It's called the boiling point depth curve. So this is the maximum enthalpy that water can have before it changes to steam. Everything on this side would be steam, and everything on this side would be hot water. And every actively convecting geothermal system follows that boiling point depth curve in the crust until it starts to become isothermal, like here or here, in the convecting interior of a geothermal reservoir that keeps the temperature relatively constant. So let's assume for the moment, I can't see anybody voting or participating, but let's assume for the moment that you're a board member of a renewable energy company, and your geologist has come to you and said, I have this fantastic prospect. We have everything well defined. We understand this completely. We need to drill some temperature gradient holes to figure out exactly where that high heat flow anomaly would wind up being. All of the things that we showed before are here, the boiling point depth curve for water, all of the gradients in the crust. And you, as an investor, are looking forward to being able to buy a new yacht because you're going to discover a geothermal resource that's going to make you rich. So we rig up and we drill. Excuse me, what's going on? So you have to ask yourself the rhetorical question, is this encouraging? Would you drill deeper? if I could see a show of hands, I'd ask you, how many of you would elect to drill deeper? Because you've just spent about $50,000 to figure out that things aren't really over here on the boiling point depth curve where I said they were supposed to be. So what do we do? Well, your geologist is incredibly persuasive, and he says, no, we're still in an area where we haven't really hit bedrock yet. We don't really know exactly what the heat flow is supposed to be. So you decide to give him a little bit more money, and instead of drilling a relatively shallow hole like 150 meters here, you're going to allow him to drill, give him enough money to drill 300 meters, which is going to cost you probably about $200,000 per hole. So we continue to drill. And this is what we see. How about this? Is this encouraging? Things are certainly heading off in the right direction. This is something that we might wind up considering being encouraging in a geothermal resource, but we're still not over here. This is where we're supposed to be. But you as an investor are encouraged, and it's worth your time and you're worth your money to try and figure out more about this geothermal resource. So you give your geologist some more money and you rig up and drill a little bit deeper. Whoa, wait a minute. What is this? Is this encouraging? Is this what you want to see? Again, aren't we supposed to be over here? And aren't we supposed to be looking at these type of gradients to get to a very high temperature resource at a very shallow depth? Well, you're concerned as an investor, but your geologist, again, is so persuasive. He's able to convince you that, yes, you've got the right model here. This is the thing that we need to do. We need to drill deeper. And so you grant him money, say on the region, in this particular case of about $2 million, to drill a hole deeper than 600 meters. And this is what you wind up seeing. The bottom hole temperature of 267 degrees C. And this is not just a hypothetical. This actually is encouraging. Those holes were drilled right here at the toe of this flow in the middle of Newberry Caldera in Eastern Oregon. In this LiDAR image, the highlighted yellowish zones here, this flow is about 77,000 years old. This flow is 3,000 years old, and this flow occurred in 690 AD. So a very active geothermal resource and a very high potential geothermal resource. So the critical thing that we started with was geology. What made those drilling glitches, the low temperatures that you will wind up seeing, why is that happening? Well, what are calderas filled with? They're filled with a lot of loose ash, a lot of loose pumice and other materials, and based on geophysics, based on a number of smaller holes, you don't really get into the bedrock of this particular caldera until you're down at least 500 meters. So you've got to be below all of that fill material that really is just an interference with that temperature signal that you're seeing from depth. You want to get to this particular point of understanding the temperature distribution within a geothermal system as quickly and cheaply as possible. That's the whole purpose of exploration, is to do this in as logical and reasonable a manner and as cheap a manner as you possibly can. But once that investment is made, you have to drill a full-size well. There's no getting around it. The only way of proving the viability of a geothermal resource, the productivity of a geothermal resource, is drilling a deep well. And thankfully, we drill a well and it's a success. You can produce high volumes of fluid at high rates, hopefully for a long, long period of time. So what do we mean by production rates, high volumes? Well, if you had water well that produced 200 gallons a minute, you'd have a very successful water well. You could do an awful lot with that. You could supply a whole ranch, a whole farm, any number of things. You could supply some industrial processes. That's quite a prolific water well. If you had an oil well that produced 200 gallons a minute, well, if you had an oil well that produced 200 gallons a minute, we really wouldn't be having this conversation, because that translates to about 6,857 barrels a day. I just checked the price of oil today. It's about $85 a barrel. So you'd be making somewhere in the range of about $512,000 a day, or somewhere in the range of $220 million a year. So in a geothermal well, we need very high production rates of about 2,000 gallons a minute, because remember, if it's a water-dominated system, we're taking only a small fraction of that to produce steam. And we're successful, though. We have a well, but that's not sufficient, because you need a number of wells to be able to take those volumes of steam and pipe it to a power plant. So an individual productive well could be capable of potentially generating maybe 5 to 7 megawatts worth of electricity. And a megawatt, for general background, for developed societies, a megawatt is a sufficient amount of energy to satisfy the electrical needs of about 1,000 people. And usually in a geothermal system, something like a 50 megawatt power plant is what you're aiming to build. So you need enough wells of 5 to 7 megawatts each to have enough steam to power the plant. And that means you're looking at somewhere around 7 production wells. And then you're also going to have to consider injection wells, because you're going to condense the fluid and put it back in the ground. And then you might want to drill a couple of makeup wells, just in case one of them winds up not being productive, or production changes, so that at least you're not going to be left without a sufficient volume of steam to produce electricity. So all the things we've been talking about, all the exploration that we've been talking about doing, is directed at establishing all of the resource questions that you need to answer. What's the temperature of the system, the depth, the quality of the fluid, permeability, is it sufficient? Because remember, that's the holy grail. We need to be able to produce enough fluid, and that's permeability dependent. What about the size, the area, the depth? And what about productivity and longevity? Because when it comes to financing a geothermal resource, we need to have all of the elements, all of the things that are defined by geology, geochemistry, geophysics, the geothermics that we did, and also reservoir engineering, to go to the bankers and say, okay, please loan me some money so I can build a power plant. And that's a sort of unfortunate circumstance about geothermal resources at this particular stage, at least conventional geothermal resources. Bankers you pretty much need to show them that the entire resource is bankable before they'll loan you any money to build power plants. So there's a considerable amount of upfront cost and upfront investment that has to be done before you can even get to the stage of being able to generate. And that's part of the problem in comparing with other renewable resources. But the principal advantage of geothermal resources is that they're base load, which means they produce 24/7 all the time, 365 days a year at a 95% reliability rate, as opposed to other renewables that you're probably familiar with, wind and solar, which are intermittent. It's not always, the wind is not always blowing, although you're in Reykjavik, it blows quite a bit. The sun is not always shining. So you have a real problem with integrating those intermittent resources into an electrical grid that depends upon almost constant flow of electricity over time, because that's what makes the grid stable. So let's return to a little bit of the lower end, the lower heat content part of the resource. because while this electrical grade part of the resource here has been very, very important over the last 5 or 6 decades in making geothermal a significant part of the generation capacity for electrical generation, it's this direct use portion here that has the greatest potential to impact our energy usage. So this is sort of your individual energy consumption. And if you notice, most of what we burn petroleum resources to do has to do with space heating or water. More than 50% of your individual energy use has to do with those elements. All the rest of this stuff over here is what you get out of electricity that allows you to do all of the things, to cook, to run your refrigerator, to turn on the lights. And this is a very significant portion of why geothermal can be so important, because direct use applications of geothermal fluids or geothermal heat can supplant all of these things. Space heating, water heating can supplant all of those things and eliminate those particular parts of petroleum resource usage. And this is a significant part of things in the Rocky Mountain portion of the US, where Katie lives, and also in the eastern United States, where the climate is a little bit colder. It's an extremely important part of the energy mix here in Reykjavik. So in 1932, Reykjavik generated almost all of its electricity using petroleum resources, mostly fuel oil, bunker oil, things like that, the standard smoggy day. But because Iceland has become almost 100% renewable, and all of the buildings in Iceland, all of the water that I can wash my hands with here, it's all heated with direct use from spent geothermal fluid from geothermal plants outside of Reykjavik. So there's very little usage whatsoever of petroleum resources except for cars. And at the World Geothermal Congress that I'm attending now in Reykjavik, there have been a number of plans proposed for 100% electrical vehicles in Reykjavik before 2030, which is easily feasible because the electricity is so readily available. And that's directly related to the use of the geothermal resource. And there are things that are possible for potentially generating power anywhere. Because remember, way, way back when we got started on this discussion, I said that the Earth is an active planet and it's increasing in temperature as you get deeper. It just doesn't necessarily increase in temperature as fast everywhere on the planet. But if you could drill to access that heat, and if you didn't have to worry about permeability, but you could create your own permeability, then potentially you could create a geothermal reservoir that allows you to pump fluid down in this blue well over here and produce hot fluid back and potentially generate electricity. And those are enhanced or engineered geothermal systems, EGS. That's a very significant part of the US DOE program. They've decided on a sort of experimental area. It's not really a new idea because it's been tried since the 1970s. But in this particular case, the DOE is taking a very careful, very measured, very scientific approach to trying to perfect techniques to do this, to do it the way it should be done, as opposed to trying to do one-shot deals to make it work. It's called Forge, and the location where it's being tried is in Utah. And in this particular case, they're trying to fracture granite at about 200 degrees Celsius and pump down cooler water and produce hot water back to make that heat exchange work, potentially to generate electricity. And there are other ways of working at this a lot of which were discussed here at the WGC, advanced geothermal systems. So if you are concerned, one of the problems with something like EGS systems is water loss or not being able to recover the fluid that you've pumped down. So why not just forget about it? Why not just do a closed loop? And the key things here, key technical hurdles, are trying to get past the heat exchange rate, because conductive heat exchange isn't exactly all that efficient. So there are a number of different advanced geothermal systems companies that are trying to do this closed loop and use alternative fluids, like, say, for instance, supercritical CO2. If we're worried about CO2 and we want to strip it out of the atmosphere, and we could potentially use that to generate electricity in a closed loop system or even in an EGS system. If we lose that fluid in an EGS system, why bother? Because we're interested in putting it away anyway. And other advanced systems that have been tried is like build your own radiator. So this particular phase here, one small loop, has been completed and tested, and it is feasible. It is possible to do it. It has to be translated. It has to be translated to a very much larger and very much hotter systems. So that's going to be the challenge. There are lots of technical hurdles to overcome, but the resource is so vast and so environmentally friendly that to not pursue it is almost a sin. So also looking at supercritical geothermal systems, which Iceland has done here in Krafla in the northern part of Iceland. So they've tried to drill down to near magmatic conditions. So remember, we've been talking about temperatures that are in the range of 200 to 300 degrees C. And in near magmatic conditions, you're approaching 400, 500, 600, 700 degrees Celsius. And they did actually drill a well in Krafla that encountered molten rock at 900 degrees Celsius. And the advantage of doing something like this is in supercritical systems, the temperatures of water are so high and the heat content is so high that with one well, you could virtually produce enough steam to generate electricity of at least 10 conventional geothermal wells because of the very, very high heat content. And these projects are being pursued worldwide, United States, notably Iceland, Italy in a geothermal field called Lardarello, and Japan. So this brings us to a not so rhetorical question. This is Mount Etna. It's the same volcano that we opened this presentation with. It's the largest volcano in Europe. It's almost continuously active. So the question is, where's the geothermal system? Where's the geothermal plant? And that's the challenge of the future. That's the challenge of overcoming these technical hurdles. Because if we could take these advanced methods where we don't necessarily have to depend upon the permeability of the system itself, we don't necessarily have to depend upon the natural permeability within a geothermal system, but we could exploit the heat, the tremendous resource that exists beneath our feet. That's the challenge of a lot of these techniques in the future. So I appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Gene. That was a great presentation. We really appreciate you being here with us today, taking time away from the World Geothermal Congress, of which I'm trying not to be too jealous that you got to see the new lava fields in Iceland and I didn't. But like I said, I'm trying not to dwell on that.
The eruption is over, but the new lava is very impressive.
Yes, I've actually had a few people send me photos, so it looks very interesting, and I wish I was there to see it with all of you. Geothermal is such an amazing source of heat and energy, and there's so much potential for people to learn about, and that are we can use as we continue to try and decarbonize our electricity grid. So lots of great stuff.
I know that part of what you're dealing with is direct use applications, and that's why I know that we emphasized electric grade resources, but that's not the only part of it, because the direct use applications have a huge potential to displace a considerable amount of petroleum use. So say, for instance, China, a couple of years ago for the GRC International session, we had one of the geothermal directors from China come and give a presentation. And he announced that over the next 5 to 10 years, China is going to spend $300 billion on geothermal. And only 25% of that is going to wind up being electric grade resources. They're building entire cities of 2 and 3 million people that are heated and cooled entirely with geothermal fluids, trying to displace their coal usage, trying to displace their petroleum resource usage. It's an extremely important part of the geothermal environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, there's definitely countries out there that are really utilizing geothermal for direct use and decarbonizing their heating and cooling, as well as, you know, some of their industrial processes and so forth. So, you know, there's a lot of great lessons that we can learn here in the US from some of those other countries like China, Iceland. You know, I know France is doing quite a bit, and other places in Europe with direct use right now. So, you know, we're definitely at the starting edge of it here in the US, and hopefully we'll come up with some great ideas from the students who are taking part in this competition. So do we have any questions from the audience today for Gene?
I do. My name is Zial Sarki. I'm an adjunct geologist, and I teach geology, and I worked in the industry for a few years at various consultant and even oil industry firms in Long Beach and the greater LA area. And my question is, would I be able to share this recording with my students?
So this recording will be posted on the Geothermal Collegiate Competitions HeroX page with a link, and that page is publicly accessible.
Okay, that's awesome. And yeah, thanks, Gene, for the great talk. I have some geologic questions in relation to the increase in temperature with increase in depth in regards to the direct relation between the two in order to expect higher flow of heat as a return back to the surface. So would that always be the case in terms of that direct relation?
Well, conductive heat loss is more limited than convective heat transfer. So that's the reason, as I said, any geothermal system, any active convecting geothermal system is a major thermal anomaly in the crust, because convection is such an efficient process in transferring heat. And that's why doing things like temperature gradient drilling, things like that, are so important. Understanding that three-dimensional outflow that I showed, getting to that point, getting to that understanding in geothermal exploration is extremely important, because the temperatures are going to trap the system. They're going to show you where the upflow of the system is. And that's why it's so critical to understand that.
And do we have such, I guess, a quote-unquote perfect system here in California up north?
Well, the geysers is the largest developed geothermal system in the world. And it is a perfect example, but it's unique, very, very unique. And so most geothermal resources are not that big. The installed capacity of the geysers, generating capacity at one particular time, was 2,000 megawatts, which means that would be the equivalent of a couple of hydroelectric dams, big ones. It hasn't necessarily stayed that way because the resource declined, and with augmented injection in replacing almost the entire mass that's being produced out of the reservoir, the system can be sustained. And that's the critical challenges for conventional geothermal systems, is trying to maintain that balance between mining heat out of the rocks and continuing to produce it. And the question often comes up, what makes geothermal renewable then, if you can deplete the resource? Well, it's renewable because more than 90% of the heat remains in the rocks, and really only about 7% of the heat is in the fluid. So as long as you're returning the fluid to the subsurface to circulate again in that fracture network that you have found, you have the chance to sustain it for a long period of time. And what about things like volcanic eruptions and things like that? How often are volcanoes replenished, where there's a considerable amount of history in ore forming systems and also in current geothermal systems, where there are multiple pulses of magma coming into the crust repeatedly over long periods of time, like 2, 3, 4 million years. So say, for instance, Long Valley, the illustration that I used initially, Long Valley has been a sort of eruptive center that covers probably about 5,000 square kilometers of magmatic input over more than a 3 million year span of time. And the caldera didn't just evolve and blow up and collapse all at once. You had to sort of generate this large volume of magma, obviously to supply the eruption. But yeah, that's what makes it sustainable.
Great. And Jean, we actually have a question in the chat. What would you recommend to young geoscientists and or engineers who want to get involved in geothermal energy?
Follow a good curriculum. A lot of geothermal deals with hard rock geology, not necessarily soft rock geology, like a lot of petroleum reservoirs produce fluids out of. So you're looking at a lot of igneous petrology. You're looking at a lot of understanding crystalline basement rocks, and probably geochemistry, very important if you're interested specifically in geophysics, pursuing several different geophysical methods, magnetics, gravity, and some MT. But if you're at a college or a university that teaches an upper level exploration geophysics course, you'd have the basics in that quite a bit. The thing that you can also do is act as an intern, which the previous questioner had mentioned. You can work as an intern for a number of exploration companies, and you'll learn a tremendous lot, a whole amount of things in a very short span of time by practical application of all that theoretical stuff that you got out of the classroom. The one thing that's a little bit difficult is geothermics, or heat flow, if you'll bear with that term. That isn't taught very often in geophysics. It's expensive to drill holes in the ground. It's not expensive to understand conductive heat flow or expand heat flow, to understand heat flow in the earth. But it is something that isn't necessarily one of the conventional geophysical applications that's taught.
Great, thanks, Jean. And yeah, Nick Fry actually just mentioned in the chat, for everyone who's on the call today, if you're a student or if you're a professor, please tell your students to join the Geothermal Rising Student Organization. It's a great organization. I know that Jean's company is one of the companies that helps to support the organization and make the university participation possible. It's a pretty active group, and they've got lots of great information in there.
You are the future. Those technological hurdles that we have to cross, you're the ones who solve it. That's the important part.
Yep. So we are just about at time. So thank you so much, Jean, for taking time today to talk with us and answer a couple of questions. For everyone who's still here, please make sure that you turn in next week for the Wednesday webinar series. We'll be talking about ethical stakeholder engagement with Lori Hyder. We are also going to be holding follow-up Friday office hours this week at 2 p.m. Mountain I believe one of my colleagues just dropped a link in there to sign up for those. It's a great opportunity to ask clarifying questions about the competition or the upcoming progress submission. If you haven't already done so, please make sure that you are following the competition on HeroX to receive updates on future webinars and updates to the challenge. We will be posting a recording of this on HeroX as soon as it has been edited and closed captioning added and so forth. If the initial progress submission for the competition is due Thursday, November 18th. So make sure you've reviewed the official rules, signed up your teams, and are ready to submit those initial deliverables by that date. If you have any questions, please feel free to email the prize administration team at geo.competition@nrel.gov or post them in the forum section of HeroX. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.